the final plateau, in-between plateau, it's called Concrete Rules and Abstract Machines, is because it was a place where it connected to the opening plateau of the book, rhizome, which is in the sense that those are the two places in the text where Deleuze and Guattari come close to explaining their way of working, how they're working. So in other words, given that the whole, the critique of representation is fundamental to Deleuze's kind of philosophical agenda, and the rejection of the image of thought based on the assumptions of representation, then the task that the two volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia set themselves, but A Thousand Plateaus in particular, is that of how does one think without representing, okay? And if one is to think without representing, that means that thinking becomes a form of doing, and the image, the contemplative image of thought, which I think Deleuze and Guattari align with representation, is undermined by this idea that thinking is a praxis, a kind of an engagement, but an engagement with what, okay? Obviously, once you kind of undermine the premises of representation, you cannot contrast theory and practice, or acting and contemplating in the way in which they have been traditionally contrasted. So what you have instead is an idea that thinking is an activity, okay, an active, is a productive practice, but what it produces can't be represented. In other words, it can't be specified in terms of any representable goals or objectives. So in other words, the nature of the practical intervention effectuated in and through thinking, and the kind of thinking that A Thousand Plateaus exemplifies, is both, has to be specified without ever presupposing a contrast with merely, in a way, with contemplative thought, because then that would be, because to do so would be to assume a kind of a reactive posture vis-a-vis representation. So in other words, you have to supersede representation without simply kind of criticizing it or critiquing it in the way in which I think Deleuze and Guattari think, Derrida's deconstruction does, in a way, in such a way that maintains a kind of, that remains at the level of logic, okay, or conceptual logic, rather than undermining the idea that there's a categorical division between logic and practice, okay, or between reasoning and doing. So that's what, so it's the, in a way, the consequences of these opening initial moves made at the beginning, both in the beginning and end of the book, that I'm interested in. And what they call, mapping, what they call, when they say that, the multiple must be made, the multiple is effectuated in and through a thinking doing, which is, in the case of the book that they're writing, distilled or incarnated in, sentences and propositions. But what they're clearly suggesting is that what they're doing is not, the book itself is not a program or a representation of the conditions for rhizomatic, agency or rhizomatic construction, or whatever you want to call it. So that's what I take the sense of the imperative, the multiple must be made to consist in. And this also means that in order for this construction to be, to be effective, i.e., it must operate under certain constraints, and the constraints are laid out in terms of what they call quantifying writing. In other words, the quantifying writing involves, the concrete rules, okay, which govern the what they call the selection and the intensification of a plane of consistency. Okay, so the text is basically explicating the logic, the logic through which the plane of consistency upon which their own writing unfolds is constructed, and how this logic is supposed to be a kind of a not a distillation, but rather, a passageway through this general kind of ontological logic of expression. Okay, that's why I think it's necessary to grasp how as they put it, expressionism and constructivism coincide. That's one of the slogans or the watchwords that they deploy in the book. You have to, I think, to understand how Emile Plateau connects back to Deleuze's earlier work on Spinoza, and particularly kind of the work on the logic of expressionism, or expressionism in philosophy, as the English translation has it. And yes, so that's the basic, I mean, I can say more, but yeah, that's the basic. Pragmatics then means that what you're trying to do can't be specified in terms of interests or purposes that you think you already possess, or the kinds of interests and purposes that are generally invoked when people try to explain practice. Okay, so in a way, this is a practice that generates its own ends, because the ends aren't simply extrinsic to the practice; they are generated through the practice itself, but but in a very determinate way, not randomly. And it's this, in a way, it's the kind of, in a way, the coincidence of chance and necessity, or of the, the aleatory and the deterministic, which I think is, very philosophically significant in the, in the writing of the book, in their kind of characterization of what the book is trying to do. And I think that it is ultimately, for all the book's, I guess, idiosyncrasy and inventiveness, it's a very, it's, as they say, as they themselves insist, or as Deleuze himself insisted when asked about, it's a traditional work of philosophy. In other words, it's how philosophy, it's a kind of the re-energization of philosophy once representation has been superseded or relinquished, and philosophy has a sense of like the conjunction of ontology and ethics. In other words, knowing what is and knowing what should be done coincide. And that's a very familiar injunction. That it goes back to kind of to Stoicism. And there's a way of understanding the book as a Stoic work. Stoicism understood as in a way, the embrace of necessity or of fatality. So one of the things I'm trying to say is that although the book rejects the representational image of thought and a kind of deterministic metaphysics, in a way, determination re-arises at a higher level in terms of the way in which the plane of immanence constructs itself through machinic assemblages. And it's in that sense in which the book, although it rejects the idea of the closed book or the spherical book, etc., or, the book as infinite self-representation, it is in fact a work that folds the outside within the inside in a way so that it's always kind of trying to, the cutting edge of deterritorialization, which is what propels rhizomatic conjunction, the conjunction of different kind of elements into intensifying vectors, is always this point where the outside is folded within the inside in a way that what seems most contingent or aleatory is ultimately a reassertion of fatality or necessity. And in a way, that's what I'm criticizing at the end of that essay. So I'm saying is that although the book seems to be a paean to exteriority and openness, in fact, it is a paean to fatality and closure, because the openness that they invoke is, hermetically sealed to anything that isn't already enveloped by this logic of intensification, which is at the heart of the book.
I have a question. When reading the essay and reading Deleuze and Guattari's section, I thought the book has all this rhetoric of liberation and emancipation with all the aesthetic implications of the word, such as destratification, deterritorialization implies. But it seems like they want to bypass normativity for any kind of logic of emancipation that would be possible. I just wanted to ask, because I couldn't find an answer myself. What would remain of a politics of emancipation if we want to bypass normativity? And I still don't understand why we should want to desire to construct the plane of consistency. If this is not normativity, then I don't know what is.
Okay, I think the question, I think the problem, or rather my problem with Deleuze and Guattari is not that there's no normativity or that they leave normativity behind, is that they reject one paradigm of normativity, okay, let's say a Kantian kind of paradigm of normativity, and replace it with another, which is to say a kind of Spinozist, kind of Nietzschean Bergsonian normativity, which in a way which fuses the is and the oughts, okay? Instead of separating, where Kant separates the is and the oughts, Deleuze and Guattari want to kind of bring it back together, where the normative injunction is always to intensify and to empower, okay? That's at the heart. What are the concrete rules for? They're rules of intensification, amplification, and what is amplified through the consolidation, the construction of the plane of immanence is the capacity to affect and be affected. Okay, the power, Spinoza's definition of a body in terms of, affects and potencies. Okay, So the idea is that, in other words, the more you intensify, in a way, it's a question both of intensifying, sensitivity, amplifying the registers of sensation and of sensitivity, but only with a view to, and also kind of intensifying potency, puissance in Deleuze and Guattari's terms. So the idea is that, and this is again, a very traditional, I'm not saying this in a dismissive way, I'm saying it's, or at least it's a very venerable fusion of the normative and the ontological. So that's why it's a mistake to think that Deleuze and Guattari reject normativity. No, the problem is that it is saturated with normativity, but the norm is always intensify, intensify your power of affecting and of being affected, in order to always kind of, to release the, well, to achieve this point of indiscernibility with the plane of immanence itself. Also, this is why when I say at the end that the account of destratification, which is, I think, is at the very core of the book, okay, because all the when they talk about the decoding of flows, that is that they're always that is a necessary kind of condition of deterritorialization. Deterritorialization presupposes destratification, okay? But destratification can only proceed on the basis that stratification is always already underway. So in a way, the concession, it's not that Deleuze and Guattari simply kind of reject mediation and evoke a kind of a brute immediacy. The point is that there is mediation in the book. The mediation they propose is what they call the middle, okay, the intermediary. Always start in the middle. That's what a rhizomes proliferate in and through the middle, in between. You always start in between. You're in between stratification and destratification. So these two vectors of stratification and destratification are always coincidental, okay? And every phenomenon is caught in between these two kind of, opposing counter tendencies. And in that regard, they can always defend themselves against the objection that they are beginning with a naive immediacy. It's not a kind of a simple appeal to vitalism as, kind of, the power of, sensation or lived experience. But the problem is that the middle itself, what is in between stratification and destratification, is itself immediately given. So in other words, mediation is immediate. Whereas, the Hegelian point is that neither mediation nor immediacy can ever be kind of strictly, separated, okay? So the point is not to replace immediacy with mediation, because then you just have another immediate mediation. And that's the problem, is that stratification, in order for deterritorialization to be constantly affirmed as an injunction, this kind of, this imperative, there has to be, stratification and destratification must always already be at work, okay? But the problem is that destratification is entirely the concept of destratification. The positive sense that is given to the word destratification in the book depends on the account of stratification, which is set out in the geology of morals. Who does the earth think it is? That's the heart of the book, okay? And as I say, the point is understanding what does the D in deterritorialization and destratification mean? That's the key to the entire book, and it means you have to assume, territorialization and stratification. Actually, stratification is the condition for territorialization, in order to understand what this D, which is the cutting edge of, deterritorialization, destratification, or how this D operates. And the way in which it operates ultimately is, explicitly, is always, contextual and depends on what they call the kind of, the analysis of a concrete assemblage. Okay, you have to understand how the kind of, a concrete assemblage incarnates an abstract machine. And on the basis of this analysis, this, kind of this mapping of these kind of forces and powers at work, then you can decide what to do. You can choose how to consolidate and intensify whatever it is you're doing. But in that sense, although they don't want representation and they don't want mapping, or rather no, they reject what they call tracing, and they want to talk about a mapping of the movement of intensities. In other words, there is a schema for mapping. Okay, there is a schema for mapping, relations or conjunctions of forces, both territorializing and deterritorializing. And it's in terms of this schema that you decide what to do. Okay, and that's what the concrete rules are there for. The concrete rules are there to allow you to understand how this concrete assemblage, incarnates an abstract machine, what forces are at play, and how they can be, consolidated in a way which will be empowering, ultimately, empowering.
Can I take a shot at a question there, Ray? Hi,
Sure.
Ray, by the way.
Hi. How are you doing? Hi.
Not too bad, yeah. I guess, I agree with your critique in a lot of respects, especially in terms of Deleuze not being able to sort of cash out these kind of binary distinctions that are frequently made in the text in terms of stratification, destratification, and so on, and how he privileges these terms. But I guess one thing, if I had to raise an issue in terms of your critique, and I really like the article, but when you talk about, you seem to speak about Deleuze as, in terms of it as being a sort of foreclosure, or that there's, an eliding of reality in a sense that's being enacted through the myopia of this work, which relies on these kind of traditional, as you might see it, traditional ontological distinctions. I think probably in terms of the mentality which generates a book like A Thousand Plateaus, it would be, quintessentially postmodern. We know with Deleuze, he says, well, philosophy is a kind of play, right? So you remark in the work yourself, well, there's some nice analogs with the sciences and so forth that are set up here. We could look at a philosophical work and say, does it agree with my inductive experience? Does it agree, are the deductive arguments strong? Okay, it's an interesting philosophical work. And that could be one kind of criteria. But of course, when we make this critique, from the standpoint of, well, reality is elided by this text because reality is more indeterminate, let's say, than what this text can possibly encompass, right? That it's significant that Kant, permits there to be a thing in itself that kind of functions as a regulator within a system, that for Hegel, there's a great suppleness and amorphousness in terms of the sort of, structure which he creates, which means that reality never becomes foreclosed or circumscribed, in this ontological way that Deleuze does. I guess one of the problems I could see with that is, of course, the fact that, whenever we, even these, systems which permit, let's say, a distinction between the is and the ought, there's a sense in which they're also normative, right? So that's Hegel's critique of Kant, right? For example, that this notion of the thing in itself ultimately isn't, philosophically tenable. By the same token, if we look at the work of Hegel, and we have the classic sort of Schellingian critique of Hegel, that the initial move, to being and then nothingness, there's something lost there, right, in this sort of conceptual translation, that the system can never account, from whence it sort of emerges, right? So, and we could look at Marx's, critique of Hegel, that, Hegel's separation of the rational and the real in a way is symmetrical with the structure of the value form, right? In terms of the way that imposes decision, right, in the structure of reality. So I guess when you make that kind of comparison and you say, well, these systems, open themselves up to precisely on account of their indeterminacy or their, the fact they don't make these sort of stringent ontological distinctions, don't you think in a way that what's already implied there is, a philosophy that could somehow free itself from normativity through, some kind of direct appeal to the real?
You mean that's implied by the critique I'm trying to make?
Yeah, implied by the critique, yeah.
Yes, the point is, so look, I think in a way it's a sign of Deleuze and Guattari's sophistication and intelligence that they don't believe you can kind of completely abdicate or kind of, you can purify your ontology of all normative commitments. By which I mean, by normative commitments, I just mean kind of, value kind of, value judgment, some kind of value ladenness of determination. So they, and rather than shying away from it, what they do is they say, well, there's an articulation of, they're rejecting one paradigm of the normative, which is basically Platonic, Cartesian, Kantian, Hegelian, which they see as oppressive and, oppressive, both intellectually oppressive, but also kind of, ethically and politically oppressive. And they're proposing a new normative paradigm, a new fusion of the ontological and the normative, which they see as emancipatory, because it's about what is being. Being is power, okay, or potency, but no longer a potency which is no longer tied to substance or unity. So being is simply this kind of this concept, this differentiate, this infinitely kind of self-differentiating power of affecting and of being affected, and one can construct an art of living, okay, from this ontology. So I'm not, so the criticism is not that it's still too normative. The point is that the normativity they propose, or in a way the way in which they conjoin the ontological and the normative, does not in fact have the emancipatory consequences that they proclaim, because in a way, for two reasons, both in a way, because both ontology, the discourse of ontology has become philosophically problematic as a result of Kant's critique, but also as a result of Hegel's critique of Kant, and ultimately of Marx's critique of Kant and Hegel. And the rehabilitation of ontology in the 20th century is due to Heidegger, okay? And it's insofar as, Deleuze's kind of embrace of ontology in the 1960s, especially in Difference and Repetition, is clearly, in a way, his kind of, his negotiation with Heidegger. The fact that he, and even in his earlier work in the, the article on Bergson from the 1950s, he explicitly wants to propose, an ontology rooted in Spinoza, Bergson, and Nietzsche, capable of countermanding what he sees as the forced choice between a phenomenological ontology, you know, in a Heideggerian sense, and a Hegelian ontology, because, you know, Jean Hippolyte's kind of logic and existence is a kind of a quasi-Heideggerian reading of Hegel. And in a way, it's an attempt to reactivate Hegel in a post-Heideggerian environment by saying that Hegel is also an ontologist, but he's not a bad ontologist. He's an ontologist who can kind of, you know, withstand the Heideggerian critique of metaphysics. In a way, so ontology is pitted against metaphysics here. But the problem is that, you know, one doesn't have to accept the terms of this alternative in a way between ontology, you know, ontology, which is anti-representation, an ontology beyond representation on the one hand, and a metaphysics, which is still tied to representation or bound up with representation. And that's the problem in a way that the kind of, that dichotomy, the way in which, you know, Mille Plateau and Deleuze's work with Guattari kind of conjoins the ontological and the ethical, you know, what there is and how to live, is, I would say, a refusal of the undermining of that conjunction of ontology and ethics, which is a consequence of philosophical modernity as consummated by Kant, Hegel, and Marx. And the Marx's is the most radical. Marx's critique of Hegel is that if Hegel is simply, you know, inviting us to kind of to embrace, to identify the rational and the actual, you know, what is actual is rational and vice versa, then his, you know, the revolutionary, modernistic impulse of his work has lapsed. He's become a kind of, he's become a pre-modern philosopher. In a way, Hegel's philosophy is compelled and propelled by, you know, this understanding of the conjunction between Kant's critical revolution and the French Revolution. And the point at which the task of philosophy simply becomes to kind of to recognize, belatedly recognize that, you know, the rationality of the actual, is the point at which philosophy fails to live up to the injunction not to describe what is or to represent what is, but to transform what is in light of what must be, okay, which is the realization of freedom. And it's freedom, okay, it's this, in a way, the key term, you know, for Marx, it's because Hegelian philosophy can't satisfy the injunction to realize freedom, to make the idea, the philosophical idea of freedom real and socially actual, that it must be superseded. So the point is that a social revolution is required to actualize freedom and to render the world truly rational. Now, it's because, in a way, so that's the benchmark for an emancipatory philosophy, or a philosophy that aligns itself with social revolution. And a philosophy, in a way, that retreats from this conjunction of critique and revolution, you know, is a philosophy in a way that, you know, has regressed, or in a way is kind of reacting against, you know, the perceived failure to successfully carry out this this realization of the 20th century, okay, which is, you know, actually existing communism and socialism. So this is why I actually don't believe the claim that Deleuze and Guattari are communists, or that they actually, their philosophy can be aligned with communist aims. And I think one of the things I'm trying to do, you know, in the work now is like actually reading what Deleuze and Guattari say about Marx, especially in Anti-Oedipus, And you realize it has all, well, if you read Marx, you know, and if you read Capital, you see that what they say bears little or no relation to what Marx is actually doing. And as I said, you know, in the second paper, is that it's a kind of, you know, quid pro quo. In other words, they don't attack, you know, they disguise their systematic rejection of Marx's basic theses and analyses by using his name, but then completely proposing counter-Marxian theses instead of his, you know, his original claims, or not original claims, but I mean his substantive claims. So the point, to sum up, the point is that ontology, it's not just metaphysics that is obsolete, is that ontology is obsolete, because ontology is only, I think as Adorno actually rightly says in an early text about the idea of natural history, is that Heideggerian ontology is just the ratification of what is, okay, of social reality understood as second nature. And philosophy must relinquish ontology in order to realize, in order to clarify the stakes of the realization of freedom, which entails refusing systematically refusing the ratification of what is, or of any kind of discourse about what is, being qua being.
Could I interrupt for a second?
Yes.
Martin Rosenberg here.
Hi.
Good to hear you speak. It seems to me that the tension between what is and the desire for freedom gets played out in precisely what you were bringing up about Spinoza and about Bergson. It seems to me that an ontology of expressionism requires a focus on process rather than on the thing in itself. And that anti-representation is really not a denial of ontology, but a shifting of ontology from what is to the nature of expression itself, as Spinoza lays it out. And now I'm going to take 1 second to shift over to Deleuze's insistence that we take into account philosophical concepts, scientific percepts, and artistic constructions by suggesting that the way towards opening up a critique of Thousand Plateaus is by looking at the ways in which those three sources of knowledge impinge upon the Thousand Plateaus. So there's a genealogy implicit there from Spinoza to Nietzsche and Bergson to the kind of thinking that was coming into visibility in the 40s and 50s, and which gets played out in Simondon, but which you can see really precisely in the work of Prigogine and Alan Turing on the physics of emergence. That the notion of irreversible time, the physics of bifurcation, which has had an impact in almost every realm of scientific inquiry since, which might be equated with the notion of individuation in Simondon, and which the reference to Turing and Prigogine you can't find in Simondon. But what's interesting is that Deleuze cites Simondon, but then points back to Spinoza to suggest where Simondon is coming from. It seems like we're talking about an ontology that's based on a completely different set of theological assumptions than what underlie Kant and Hegel and Plato and Aristotle. And it seems to me, knowing your work just a little bit, that you're critiquing 1,000 Plateaus, which to me is playing out the implications of not a rejection of representation, but an insistence that the ontology be based on process and not things in themselves. That you're using logic, which is rooted in the first ontology, in order to critique a completely different ontology. Did that make sense?
Yes, it did. Yes.
I think you might, if you know me, you know where I'm coming from. I'm a theorist of and a historian of emergence.
Mm-hmm.
And we may have met at the Warwick conference on Pynchon. I'm not sure that Dan O'Hara and Eric did in '94, but that's beside the point. So I'm wondering, what does that do? What does it do to notice that there are representational features in 1,000 Plateaus when the rhetorical project, philosophical project of 1,000 Plateaus is to assert this ontology of process and emergence, and not a static being behind reality?
Okay, let me try and respond. This is a very, very interesting question, but the first aspect of my response would be to say that I'm not simply, my criticism is not simply the claim, oh, Deleuze and Guattari claim, they claim to reject representation, but here they are representing something. That's not my criticism, because they're very clear about, if you think in that way, you think, in a way you kind of, you construct a kind of an artificial dichotomy between, let's say, process and substance, or between kind of, movement and stasis, etc. And their point would be that, the traditional, if logic is always on the side of representation, if the resources of conceptualization are always on the side of representation, then philosophy, as an art and science of the concept, becomes redundant, a priori, and all that's left is is some kind of mysticism. And Deleuze has always rejected that. Okay, Deleuze insists that the point is, once you can expose the fallacious logic, the fallacious premises of the logic of representation, you can propose an alternative logic, a non-representational logic, a logic of difference in and for itself, which is what he does in Difference and Repetition and Logic of Sense. And then you can understand how the problem is not how we can the problem is to understand how is to criticize the traps, okay, the conceptual traps that lead you to think, that lead you to restrict thinking to to identification and the subordination of difference to identity, and the identification of thinking with representing. So Deleuze and Guattari have an account of the logic of expression and the logic of construction involved in what they call mapping or constructing the plane of immanence. And the work itself is full of, its conceptual inventiveness is a consequence of this. That they create the conceptual resources they need to be able to map the plane of immanence. So here, in a way, thinking is no longer representing. So the concepts are already kind of, mapping the processes, the movements that they are ostensibly about. But of course, they're not about them in the sense of representing. They are themselves a manifestation. The thinking, the conceptualizing that is going on in the book is itself a manifestation or an expression of the movements that they are, as they say, not representing, but mapping or expressing. So this is why I think one of the great strengths of their work is to kind of is the way they circumvent this. It's only from the vantage point of representation that you think that movement, becoming, multiplicity, etc., are simply the kind of the abstract negation of stasis, identity, unity, etc. Okay, so they want to undermine that. They say that very opposition is representational. And once, we've subverted the conceptual premises of that opposition, we can understand that to think the multiple is also to make the multiple, as they put it.
In other words, that they are doing a philosophy of expression.
Yes.
Insofar as their work enacts the very process of non-representational accounts of the physical world and the world of ideation.
Yes, but that very kind of contrast is itself representational. So it's not like you have the physical, the biological, the chemical. In a way, the whole account of stratification is to show stratification is more fundamental than representation, because they say, this is already a point made by Bergson, is that in a way, why is the world amenable to representation? If representation is simply an illusion or a fallacy, the problem is you have to explain why would anyone, how does it ever come about, okay? If it was merely an illusion, it could be easily dispelled and corrected. But the point is that the world generates its own representation. There are real processes in the world that, set the conditions for its representability. This is why representability is not, it's a domain of transcendental illusion, but transcendental illusions are necessary. And as I understand it, the whole account of stratification is to show how, the world, stratifies, segments, sedentizes, generates kinds of the segmentations and the interruptions of these flows and processes through which utilitarian representation can get hold. And here they follow Bergson. Representation is not, it's not that representation is false, it's that it's merely an instrument. It's a utilitarian instrument which certain organisms need to be able to navigate reality. And the philosophical mistake is to think that what is in fact merely an instrument, a tool whereby, certain kind of, organisms can, better navigate their environment is, an adequate kind of, an adequate account of what there is. So the challenge is to show how the world generates organisms that need to represent, and how, it's certain aspects of the world lend themselves to representation, but how representation is only a very kind of, incomplete, partial and selective account of what is really going on, of these more kind of ubiquitous and deep-seated processes. So that's what and it's these processes then that the book sets itself to express, okay? But to express them, you have to construct concepts. But now the problem of representation, which was the problem of what is the relationship between a concept and the thing it is supposedly represents? Now this, even if you've gotten rid of intentionality and kind of representation as correlation between idea and object, now the logic of expression, which is how do we construct concepts that adequately express these fundamental processes, these flows, processes, whatever you want to call them, then the problem re-arises in a more, kind of challenging form, is that there has to be a criterion for what is a successful expression, i.e. An expression that, succeeds in constructing and expressing immanence, becoming, whatever you want to call it, and one which fails, one which still, lapses back into representation. And the book itself, this is why when they say the multiple, this book is a rhizomatic construction, this book is a process of construction. Well, a construction has to be constrained, otherwise, it would be, there has to be a criterion of success and failure in constructing. The difficulty is that you can't appeal to the utilitarian criteria that govern representation. So now the new criteria for distinguishing between, successful and unsuccessful expression and construction are those of whether or not it intensifies and amplifies the power of expressing, okay? And that's what the account of, that's what the chapter about, concrete rules and abstract machine does. And that's why they say that the book, when they say that the book is a toolbox, it's the most, everyone remembers it. If the book is a toolbox, okay. Well, the problem is that in a toolbox, the tools, you know what the tools are for, okay? Spanners, hammers, screwdrivers, okay? You can tell what the tools are for, and the tools are constructed according to the effectuation of pre-established finality. But a pre-established finality is a representation. So now these tools, the tools of which this particular, box book consists, can't be identified in terms of pre-established finalities. In other words, what the tools for which, the tools that are being constructed in and through the book can only be specified by tasks that the book is also constructing and expressing, okay? So this is why, in a way, it's in this sense that the book succeeds, it succeeds beautifully in, saying what it does and doing what it says. But the cost of this consistency, the cost of achieving this consistency is that the problem with, you mentioned Spinoza, okay? Well, Spinoza says there's only one substance, okay? Infinite eternal substance with an infinity of attributes, but we can only know two, okay? Thought and extension. The problem is that, now, the reason we can know two is because thinking is an expression of this substance, and it's through thinking and the fact that we think that we participate in the expression of this infinite substance, okay? But then the problem is if thinking is an expression of this infinite substance, and the relationship between the infinity of substance and the infinity of the attribute of thought is in the the intellection as the immediate infinite mode in which the finite human intellect is subsumed. That allows us to grasp the essence of substance and achieve the third kind of knowledge. But the third kind of knowledge, if it is to succeed in expressing the infinity of substance, must give voice to the infinity of its attributes, okay? The qualitative infinity of its attributes, okay? And in a way, the problem of rhizomatic construction and the problem about the assemblages, the assemblages, abstract machines, concrete assemblages, all the different conceptual functions cataloged in 1,000 Plateaus would have to correspond to characterizations of attributes. And the question here is, well, how do you, if thinking is, are these the only, how do we know? And I use the word know because you can't simply dismiss the word know as part of the machinery of representation, because Spinoza insists on that you have to know the infinity of substance, and know its attributive infinity. How do we know that these conceptual tools and these instruments successfully manifest the attributive infinity of the single substance? Okay, Spinoza is a rationalist. Spinoza thinks we can know substance, and it's because we can know substance that we can act according to and kind of achieve beatitude, achieve this kind of coincidence of knowing and doing. Once you get rid of knowing, okay, you have a problem, okay? Because the problem is that it keeps reappearing, okay? The more you repress it, the more it's the consequences of repressing it keep manifesting themselves in the book. So in other words, how do you construct concepts that are supposed to successfully express the infinity of substance. In this case, the plane of immanence, okay? The plane of immanence with its kind of, intensities and particles and a-signifying signs, etc. If the only criterion the criterion is not one of, truth and falsity, but of intensification or disintensification. And this is when the book, this is the circularity, I mean. This is when you have to believe that, whatever, because the book is ultimately, it's not a transcendent object. It's not a book written by God, for God. It's a book written for creatures existing in between, the plane of immanence and the plane of consistency, between the kind of the pure movements of becoming on the earth and everything that is facialized, stratified, subjectified, etc. Then we cannot but make the selection between what is empowering and disempowering, or what is a successful expression and a kind of an unsuccessful one, in terms of our own interests and predilections, which is why to say that subjectivism, the subjectivism that is, that they see as like a congenital defect of representation, reasserts itself with a vengeance at the book's conclusion. Because they say, remember when they say, the point is no longer to say I, but to achieve the point where it no longer matters whether or not one says I.
How would one know where it would no longer matter?
That's the question. That's the question. If you believe the point is not, and this is the power, again, the power and sophistication of Deleuze and Guattari's account, the point is not to de-stratify and merge with the plane of immanence. Because if you do that, you're resubstantializing it, and you turn the plane of immanence into a transcendent telos, okay? The point is that if you think that the point is to merge with the plane of immanence, then you relapse into an ideal of mystical fusion, which is simply the erasure of identity, the erasure of every kind of stratified distinction. The point, they insist, is to use stratification in order to release a becoming or a movement. The problem is stratification is not the enemy in and of itself. It's only when it's kind of elevated as the only kind of or the only paradigm or the dominant paradigm. So given that it's about negotiating between stratification and destratification, or between flux and permanence, then this negotiation cannot be adjudicated using criteria that will be that are themselves in between, which is to say, the conditions on the allocentric anthropomorphic strata.
If I could interrupt, where does success fit into this? Because success suggests permanence. Why is success a value-laden criteria for evaluating this book?
I use the word success, two things. One, success is not necessarily permanent. If you win a game, you just won, you can make a winning move in a game. There's nothing permanent about it. Okay? You can have, success can be as evanescent and fleeting as one wishes. Secondly, you can dispense with the word success. If you're doing something, if you're constructing something, the moment you're distinguishing constructing from something else, then there has to be, you're doing something So there has to be some way of discriminating between, if you don't want to use the word successful, between, you know, let's say an empowering and a disempowering construction, or an intensifying or a, you know, disintensifying, whatever. What I'm saying, but whatever words you use will simply be ciphers, will simply be placeholders for success and failure. And this is the point, is that you can't do something, you can't be trying to, doing is an achievement word, okay? And you're constrained by, if you're doing something as opposed to not doing anything, then there has to be some way of distinguishing between achieving and not achieving, even if, but of course, not all achievement is teleological in this bad representational sense. I mean, that's a, in a way, it's once you realize that, once you get rid of this kind of, this cartoonish stereotype of, you know, what success and failure are, of what, like, you know, achieving and not achieving are, you realize that, you know, you cannot but be compelled by this minimal discrimination between, you know, achieving and not achieving. And as soon as you do this, then there has to be a selection, a criterion of selection. And they're explicit about this. They propose, and they're explicit about what that criterion is. It's about intensification or disintensification.
I just want to pick up on this question of words as ciphers and the kind of pragmatics that this leads us into. Hello, by the way. I've admired your work for many years, so it's nice to get a chance to discuss it with you.
Hi.
So concerning words as ciphers, so I noticed in this essay you do this sort of twofold distinction. So you set up D and G as kind of this classical ethical pairing, and you try and distinguish them firstly from materialists, so Marx, Althusser, et al., and then from other pragmatists, so Sellers, Rorty, Brandom, and so on, with this kind of machinic, you say the machinic materialists and then machinic pragmatists as well. And I'm very interested in hearing how do you think their efforts compare, and how has the sort of mainstream of pragmatism you sort of raise as the abject there, how does that relate to your reading? And especially this notion of articulation, the twofold double articulation. Yeah, which to me this seemed very redolent of Brandom's explication. Similarly, the focus on strata and your reading of strata. Maybe this is just me reading into it, but it seems strikingly similar to this essay and speech, How Has Analytic Philosophy Failed Neuroscience, which sort of does the same thing with Frege, sort of talks about Frege's tears, and this is Brandom's kind of reading of analytic philosophy's unique bounty. So I'm curious about, clearly there's a lot of this Brandom vocabulary, the normative commitments versus normative statuses, which is another framework used earlier in this talk. So what role do you see, what relation do you see articulation, explication, strata, and tiering, like what are you sort of getting at? And if you're rejecting Deleuze and Guattari, what's left there, and how pragmatic is your account? And are you hoping to kind of have a more informed Salazian Deleuzian dialogue, or is it a matter of one replacing the other?
Okay, thanks. That's a difficult question. I mean, a couple of things. One is that, so the term, I think I use the term machinic pragmatism, okay? As well, that's one way in which, one possible way to characterize what Deleuze and Guattari are doing, because of this, emphasis, especially in A Thousand Plateaus, on doing, the primacy, the consequence of their kind of rejection of representation is that thinking is a kind of doing. So they reject the reason that they, the new conceptualization of doing that they propose is, incompatible with philosophical pragmatism, or at least kind of, philosophical pragmatism in the line that goes, I got from Peirce to kind of, to Brandom, is that they think that it's not, you can't privilege a doing or a paradigm of practice, which is, which they think is beholden to, I guess, to purposes or ends or interests that can be read off either from, from a philosophical psychology or, a philosophical sociology. So in other words, in a way, this is the post-human bit. Okay, the post-human bit is that they think because they reject, for them, American pragmatism is still too humanist. It's human beings that that do things, and human beings, have the kind of the way in which human beings are agents, and human agency is tied to social agency, collective, cognitive and normative practices, which, although they might be embedded in, biological nature, are in some sense irreducible to it. Okay, and in a way, what Deleuze and Guattari want to do, in a way, is that they want to kind of to reaffirm the continuity between, they want to kind of undermine the kind of the distinction between first and second nature and reaffirm the continuity between human doing and non-human doing, but without simply, without kind of dissolving what they take to be kind of crucial kind of discontinuities. Hence their distinction between the kind of, which is often elided in discussions of the book, between the three fundamental varieties of strata, what they call the kind of the physical, the physical, the biomorphic, and the allocentric or anthropomorphic. Okay. So it's kind of, it's pragmatism. It's a pragmatism where thinking and doing are supposed to be kind of, conjoined. But, what is to be done and how it's to be done is going to be kind of characterized in terms of this, this ontological construction, this kind of, in which everything is doing something, everything is expressing something, everything is, kind of expressing some kind of potency of being to a greater or lesser extent, depending on its characteristics. So in a way, it's a kind of naturalism, but in a way, that's one of my objections to it. It's a kind of they don't use the word metaphysical, but like, you could say it is a kind of a traditional metaphysical naturalism, which wants to, abolish the idea of a hierarchical discontinuity between nature and culture, and want to say that everything that is understood as specifically cultural can also be understood in terms of these, ubiquitous ontological processes. But while at the same time, retaining a kind of, a strategic privilege for the human. Again, it's often disregarded because they claim that it's precisely, on the, what they call the anthropomorphic or allocentric strata that, humans can do more to give, to express this, the deterritorialized or whatever you want to call it, than, than other creatures or life forms. And my criticism is that I think that that's, again, that re-injection of the normative and the natural it's very seductive, and it's done, in a way, this is one of the most sophisticated versions of it, but it's also kind of, you know, objectionable, you know, on philosophical grounds and on political grounds. And as I said, I mean, I'm just repeating what I said at the beginning, because I think the true, you know, it's Marx as the philosopher who understands, it seems to me, how the conditions under which, you know, what we can, you know, since what we know about the world, once we understand that what we know about the world is a function of, you know, our social relations and what we do without knowing that we're doing it, understanding, you know, how social relations condition and constrain both our possibilities of thinking and doing, entails that nothing less of, you know, social revolution, a complete radical reconfiguration of social relations, you know, can truly, you know, in a way, can truly liberate thinking. Okay, it's only if we change, you know, modes of social reproduction, what we do every day without understanding that we're doing it, that we can hope to discover those aspects of the world that are currently imperceptible or recluded from us. So I think that this is why I think that there's a kind of a radical epistemological promise encoded in Marx's kind of revolutionary project. And it's because it's precisely the philosophy that thinks its task is to kind of ratify the rationality of the actual, or to find it, you know, a clever and ingenious way of saying how things really have to be the way they have to be. It's only by completely rejecting this, you know, on the basis of a program of like realizing freedom in the most radical sense, that we can come to know, we can both become in ways which are currently unenvisageable for us, and also come to, you know, to know those aspects of the world which are shrouded from us because of our, you know, prejudices and preconceptions. So in a way, that's why it goes back to the Spinoza question. Is like, if there's an infinity of attributes, okay, why can't you know them? You know that there's only two, but your account implies that you should be able to kind of to express the other ones as well. So you can't just stop and say, you know, you have to explain why you can't, why thinking, which is itself supposed to be a manifestation of qualitative infinity, can't register, which is to say, can't kind of successfully, you know, manifest this qualitative infinity. And Marx's answer is that, yeah, that would only become possible through a complete transformation of our social being, and therefore of our, you know, modes of perception and thinking.
I just wanted to maybe just ask another question, if it's okay. I mean, I think in Marx's work, there's a real tension between, you know, before, I think when you described Marx, you spoke about it in a certain way as a kind of continuation of the Hegelian project, in a certain sense, right? That, you know, this is something that's going to be worked out kind of on the terrain of representation. And once we bring about, you know, social revolution, this will enable answering those questions in a better way. You know, I also think within Marx's work, there's a strong critique of, you know, representation of the Hegelian sort. So of course, Marx says that, you know, Hegel's logic is the logic of political economy, right? And specifically, he links up the way that Hegel interprets history to the category of labor, right? Which we could go and discuss even the relationship between that and Smith and sort of Newton's physics. But part of the idea here is that, you know, in a way, what we call the labor of the negative is in a sense human labor, right? Insofar as the rational in Hegel as sort of capital or dead labor, which directs, you know, which governs over the real, right? Which is represented as labor in this sort of comparison. And, you know, I think, and of course, you know, compared to certain past systems, you can say there's a kind of fluid, somewhat more fluid relationship between the two. But I think, you know, in many respects, Marx can be seen as challenging that. And I think so. I think if you stay within kind of the Hegelian paradigm, right, if you say, well, you know, representation, this is you know, the transhistorical kind of problematic that we're trying to work out, which I think actually elides a lot of important distinctions as well about, you know, how representation itself is conceived. You know, where does the subject-object distinction come from? Where does the notion of substance come from? But if you stay within that perspective, there are certain problems which emerge, right? So I'm thinking in a way of, Ben Woodard has a great essay called User Errors, and he's talking about Brandom, and he says, you know, Brandom seems to go too far in a certain way of presupposing the kind of equality of reasoners. And when I read that, I was thinking about Marx's comments on commodity exchange in the first chapter of Capital, where he kind of discusses commodity exchange in this abstract fashion, right? You know, in which people are just making goods and exchanging them freely. But throughout Capital, what he shows is that there's no actual equality to the structure. So what Marx is suggesting here is that, you know, even if we analyze the world on the terrain of representation, right, you know, and sort of privilege, you know, these kind of individual or atomized units whose representation then maybe indexes, right, to a figure of the rational, right, which would be like accreted dead labor, that this doesn't do justice to the real structure of reality. I think if there's a problem in Marx's work, it's that because he sees the focus on representation as being, I think, characteristic of, you know, the history of the value form and the capitalist mode of production, he makes certain suggestions about what, you know, what thinking beyond representation would represent, but he's not able to or willing to cash them out because he wants his critique of capital to be an immanent critique. But that's sort of where I see Deleuze as entering this debate in a way, because I see Deleuze as trying to, you know, if we're going to talk about Deleuze and communism, you know, using this sort of expressive model to try to think in an ontological manner that is, you know, beyond representation, beyond capital. But maybe you could say that he goes too fast, right? And then in a certain way ends up reprising certain structures or presumptions which are precisely capitalist in nature, which is what like Badiou or something would criticize him for, right?
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, it was a complicated comment, and you began by talking about this about representation and the. I mean, Hegel is already a kind of, you know, as many commentators have now pointed out, is, you know, Hegel is already a critic of representation. There's a, you know, kind of very detailed. Hegel thinks that kind of to think philosophically is to think beyond representation. In Hegel, you know, it's the the distinction between reason and understanding. You know, the understanding is representational, but reason kind of, you know, can think beyond, in and through, kind of the structural contradictions of representation. But it can't dispense with it, and I think that it's one thing. I mean, so in a way, the critique of representation is not peculiar to kind of the 20th century philosophy. It doesn't begin with Heidegger and, you know, consummate itself with kind of Deleuze and Guattari. In Hegel, in a way, what they're doing is that their critique is an alternative to Hegel's critique. It's because they reject the consequences of the Hegelian critique of representation that they propose this alternative critique, which reactivates ontology. And what seems to me, you know, really important about, you know, Hegel's kind of critique is that he says that, you know, it's not, you can't oppose reason to representation. Only representation would oppose reason to representation. The point is, you know, representation is indispensable. You need to represent, you need opposition, contrariety, truth, falsity, etc., categorization, in order to kind of to pinpoint the, you know, the fundamental contradictions, the fundamental kind of inconsistency or impasses, you know, which point to something, you know, which are the indices of the in itself, okay, or what kind of what concept and what conceptual categorization, you know, fails to, successfully integrate and synthesize. But the point is that this, you know, failure can then be overcome, you know, through a higher kind of, through dialectical kind of, you know, reasoning. And then the point is that at the point at which dialectical reasoning consummates simply in the identification of, you know, the actual and the rational, in a way, is where Marx's critique, this is where Marx would say that Hegel has perhaps conceded, you know, it's one thing to insist on the indissociability of reason and representation, but there's a point at which if you simply, you know, the speculative identity of thinking and being need not entail the philosophical ratification of the actual. And Marx then sees that this ratification is based on a failure to recognize what is operating behind the back of reason's own kind of critique of representation. In other words, that there are social forms that structure reason's own dialectical articulation of the blind spots of representation. Okay, so that's and Marx in Capital, the critique of political economy, you know, in a way is a point at which you use a kind of a speculative logic to kind of to show how, you know, thinking can grasp these abstract social forms that condition thinking itself behind its back. Okay, and doing so is the precondition for, it's by identifying these kind of social forms, you know, these real abstractions, that you pave, you know, you kind of you prepare a social transformation. Now, okay, I think that's my response to the first half of your comment. And then, can you remind me of, you know, yeah, well, I don't think that does justice to kind of the last bit you said about Deleuze and Guattari, that in a way, okay, the Marx's point is that this is where, unless you understand how philosophical logic is itself socially constrained, how the logic, even abstract philosophical conceptualization, is still unconsciously inflected and structured by these opaque social forms, which you know, philosophical self-consciousness or philosophical self-reflection cannot see. This is what Marx is exposing. Okay, so this is what philosophy, and the point is that this is not something that philosophy can simply integrate and continue doing business as usual, because the idea of a social unconscious, the idea is that there are kind of things, you know, we generate through our practical kind of, you know, reproductive activities, these structures that prevent self-consciousness from, you know, transparently kind of grasping the structure of the actual. Okay, so that doing generates opacity within the actual itself, and it's only by, you know, registering these blind spots in philosophical self-consciousness that you can, you know, really kind of, take the next step forward. And that's what, and the point would be that Deleuze and Guattari, although they kind of try to kind of align, Marx and Freud, Marxism and psychoanalysis, in a way by re-ontologizing them, they miss the force of, the most radical aspects of an immanent critique. The idea that the logic, the forms of logic commensurate with philosophical self-consciousness are conditioned by real abstractions or kind of social logics that are refractory to consciousness.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
How do you think then Marx and maybe Freud or even Lacan may be used as a supplement or even a critique of Brandom and Sellers' account of reason, and maybe their Brandom's in particular supposition of this transparency of commitments?
Okay. Yes, this is the key. Well, this is something I'm working on. So I think from a Marxian viewpoint, I mean, in a way, the rejection, the rejection of what Sellers calls the framework of givenness, because I think it's important to, the myth of the given isn't just kind of empiricism or naive positivism. What Sellers calls the framework of givenness is operative at the level of a kind of, transcendental phenomenology and a kind of, metaphysical rationalism as well. If you think that thinking or self-consciousness is purely transparent to itself, that's another manifestation of, the framework of givenness. So in a way, and there's a difference between Sellers and Brandom here, is that I think that Sellers does recognize that there's something that in a way, they're what he calls representings in themselves, non-conceptual representings, are not themselves transparent to, self-consciousness, or, the resources of the space of reason. Whereas I think that for Brandom, in a sense, and part of the, I think the problem perhaps with Brandom is that there is this assumption that instead of the distinction between in a way, the kind of the phenomenal and the noumenal, which Brandom rejects as a kind of Kantian residue. In Sellers, you simply have the implicit and the explicit. So in other words, with Brandom, there are, implicit kind of, activities, which, condition, our thinking and doing, and they can simply be rendered explicit. The task is of explicitation, and explicitation is in a way the coming to self-consciousness. In a way, the Marxian point would be that there are, to say that, we do things without knowing that we're doing them, is to say that, it's not to say that we kind of, they're implicit, in our practices, and they've simply, to be rendered explicit, is to say that they are, our self-consciousness is structured around their occlusion, okay? In a way, the condition of transparency in one register is opacity at the level of, social practice. So in a way, so that the space of reasons is, it's not that the space, simply that the space of reasons is kind of embedded in these kind of, opaque social practices, that it would be that the kind of, the space of reasons is actually kind of traversed or kind of, split by these, in a way, by kind of unconscious social forms on the one hand and libidinal dynamics on the other hand. Okay, Now, this is not to say that they cannot be, that they're unconceptualized. Of course, they can be conceptualized, and Marx and Freud provide the resources for conceptualizing them. But the way in which they do this shows that the power, or our autonomy, our power of self-transformation, our freedom, can't simply be kind of adjudicated at the level of self-consciousness, as Hegel most famously thought. So that the desire of self-consciousness, the desire that elaborates in and through self-consciousness, which leads to the kind of, because self-consciousness desires itself, desires another self-consciousness. Freedom as this kind of intersubjective realization is insufficient unless one understands how this desire is kind of vitiated by these unconscious social structures and drives, libidinal kind of drives. So so in a way, it's weirdly, I actually think that Sellers is more compatible with Marx and Freud and Brandom. I think there's more space in Sellers for Marx and Freud than perhaps there is in Brandom. Partly, I think, because he underestimates, in a way, his whole kind of account. I think his characterization of Marx and Freud as genealogist is inadequate. I think, Nietzsche might be a genealogist, and Nietzsche Foucauldianism is genealogical, but I don't think Marx and Freud are genealogists. And what their theoretical, in a way, they're the most radical kind of heirs of the Enlightenment. In a way, Enlightenment enlightens itself by seeing its own kind of blindnesses, its own kind of congenital blindness. And the consequence of that is I think still, the consequences of that kind of realization are still being worked out. The Frankfurt School, Adorno, most kind of impressively struggles with this legacy. But I think we're still at that moment of trying to work out the long-term ramifications of this, of the achievements of Marx and Freud vis-a-vis Kant and Hegel.
But to be fair, what regarding?
So I have to say, I think that I'm totally in agreement concerning Brandom's reading of Marx, and I think he accepts this kind of rather middle brow bracketing of Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx as pursuing the hermeneutics of suspicion, which kind of leaves them this sort of undifferentiated slop of critique or paranoid reading or whatever you want to call it. So I think Brandom is quite unforgivably ham-fisted when it comes to Marx. But as a reader of Hegel, I think this catchphrase of his, Hegel's non-psychological conception of the conceptual, I think, like, considering the non-psychological conception of the conceptual and Marx's modal analysis, probably to me would present some problems with bracketing Marx and Freud so simply, because I feel like there's often a shift in registers into sort of slipping in this sort of Zizekian, Lacanian move of sort of saying, well, Marx was thinking of things in terms of the unconscious, which I think, especially having read Brandom, I think it's quite difficult to make the case that that's what he was doing. Like, when I read Brandom and I read Marx's modal analysis, to me, it seems very clear that this process of like clearly there are commonalities between Freud and Marx, but I like quite clearly Marx's siding is more with Hegelian consciousness and immanence and so on, and crystals having a consciousness and so on than Freud. That's my own little axe to grind, but I think that's sort of what Brandom shouldn't be underestimated simply by his reading of Marx in terms of the consequences he's going to cast on Marxian.
Sure. No, Brandom's, engagement with Hegel is enormously kind of powerful, and I'm still trying to work out, how much of it I would accept. But no, I take your point. I do take your point. However, and I'm not I don't propose simply to to align, you know, Marx with Freud at the level of like, you know, I think, you know, Marx obviously as far as I know, doesn't use the term, but I'm unconscious, but I simply mean that the idea that there's something, although Marx's own, the critique of political economy is in a way the most acute kind of form of, you know, social self-consciousness, like pointing out how, you know, and in a way it's critical in the sense that it's trying to show how the conditions, you know, that the categories of political economy can only successfully represent social reality on the basis of social conditions, social relations, which political economy also includes. So in a way, it it represents by blotting out something. And in this sense, so when I use the word unconscious in Marx, I'm saying that what Marx is trying to do is to show how the conditions for us, you know, self-consciousness, the self-consciousness that Hegel is trying to you know, articulate, involves also recognizing these, you know, how, in a way, you know, the way in which blindness is a condition of vision in certain circumstances. And that's why it's a critique of political economy in both a kind of a Kantian sense as well. So it's showing you know, the conditions of possibility under which the categories of political economy can you know, successfully align with social reality, while also, you know, so that successful representation requires some kind of, you know, misrepresentation on another level. And it's that relation between, I guess, you know, successfully representing and misrepresenting, or the role of misrepresentation and representation, which is, you know, that's what kind of socially necessary false consciousness is, that, you know, you have to, it's socially necessary. It's not just a subjective illusion. But thanks for that point.
Another parallel I haven't heard you mention or sort of talk about before. I don't know if you've read Carl Sax's book about Brandom and McDowell. So Carl Sachs makes the point that one limitation of Brandom is that RDRDs are really helpful, but there's something that something can do by rusting, and they're also something that a parrot can do. So he's basically saying 2 plies isn't enough plies to talk about experience and grasping. His answer seems like a bit of a Baroque one. He borrows from Merleau-Ponty. So it's all sellers, sellers, sellers plus Merleau-Ponty to sort of fill in that gap, which for you, I think I'm basically entirely using your work, but I think that this is an interesting area. So our intendings are already in some way impregnated by these past conditions, and we can look at it through this psychoanalytic Freudian lens. I'm at the moment looking at it in a slightly different way, which is probably closer to the Merleau-Ponty side of it. So Ilyenkov would talk about how it's actually not in me, it's in the piece of wood that we have this, the part of the desire that I feel in using a piece of wood is already in the piece of wood, and in that it is treated as a particular piece of wood to me. So that basically these things are within phenomenology in the world. So the world like solicits or invites certain actions. I wonder whether you have a position on these ideas of affordances and solicitations as a way to explain unconscious experience, sorry, non-conceptual experience.
Okay, yes, no, I know, I've read Carl's book. I think it's, it's a great book. So the key distinction he makes is between, discursive intentionality, which he thinks Brandom, kind of gives a good account of, and somatic intentionality, which he thinks is required to kind of, in a way, to bridge this gap, okay? Otherwise, so as not to introduce a kind of non-viable kind of, hiatus between RDRDs, reliable differential responsive dispositions, which are ubiquitous in nature, like rusting iron, and full-fledged kind of, sapience, okay? So he talks about bifurcated intentionality. So intentionality is bifurcated between the somatic and the discursive. And Merleau-Ponty's work, especially his kind of phenomenology of perception, shows how, somatic, in a way, somatic intentionality is, in some sense, the precondition for, discursive intentionality. I think, in a way, this is a tricky point, but I fear, I see that there's a kind of the dangers of an implausible kind of hiatus between sentience and sapience, as if, you have to kind of try to articulate, you distinguish sapience from sentience and insist on its sapience as their reducibility to sentience, but you have to somehow articulate them without simply kind of showing that one, kind of ineluctably emerges from the other. But the danger of bifurcating intentionality is that somatic intentionality in a phenomenological register presupposes a concept of sense of meaning in a way of which is of non-conceptual meaning, which I find problematic. And this is a residue of Heideggerianism, which I also find problematic, in that Dasein's, Dasein has, so to speak, a kind of a preconceptual understanding of its environment, its ability to kind of to cope, its skillful coping, its ability to kind of to navigate the world and to kind of, to use things requires, this recognition of, different kind of, different ways of being, the different ways in which things are kind of manifest or available. But this understanding is not yet conceptual. It can be rendered conceptual, but it's not yet, it's pre-ontological understanding. Now the problem is that, and I see it that, so for Merleau-Ponty, he shifts it to this kind of register of embodiments and our sensory capacities, whereas our sensory capacities are already kind of intentional. But intentionality presupposes the intending of a sense or of a meaning. And I think, it seems to me that the strength of this post-Kantian account is to insist that kind of, meaning, is to insist that, meaning, words are not signs, that meanings are not simply kind of indices or kind of indexes for kind of, practical transactions between an organism and its environment. And the danger of, reintroducing something like full-fledged intentionality, of using the word intentionality in a somatic register, is that there is this kind of layer of non-conceptual meaning, which has to be always already there, which is transcendental, okay? So because itself, it can't be constituted, it seems, by any kind of, it's the condition of intelligibility for kind of at the explicit conceptual level. So it itself is in some sense kind of, there or given. And that this would be, and I think there's a problem there. So I think that I think that in a way, if one insists on rejecting the framework of givenness, one has to insist that meaning is conceptual, and that, you know, it can be very, very kind of, you know, complex, and, you know, but I think that if you start to kind of spread meaning, you know, over the world, re-infuse the kind of the world or the sensory realm with meaning in this sense, with meaning in this full-fledged sense, while insisting that it's kind of not conceptual, that's kind of, you know, I think worrisome, or at least it worries me. So I think that, and here actually, I think that psychoanalysis is like, actually, maybe Lacanian psychoanalysis is very kind of interesting, because it says that there is, you know, a register of unconscious meaning, that there is a kind of a level, the level of, you know, there's a domain of signification, you know, in this, you know, which conditions kind of, you know, consciousness, but it can't be cashed out in terms of intentionality, okay? And here, I mean, although, you know, I'm just talking off the top of my head, but I'd be more inclined to go, if you wanted to expose the non-conceptual conditions of conceptualization, or the non-discursive conditions for, you know, discursive intentionality, then it seems to me that it would be better to do it in a kind of, you know, psychoanalytic register, where you have this account of, you know, kind of unconscious kind of signification, which is kind of, which is not ontologized. I mean, the key thing is it's not ontologized, and it's not taken to be kind of this, you know, as that unfortunate expression of Merleau-Ponty's goes through, you know, the flesh of the world, you know. So I'm very sympathetic to kind of Carl's account. And I don't have a kind of, it's not as if I have a kind of, I see the problem, I don't have a kind of a satisfactory alternative, but I'd be very reluctant. I don't think it's possible to simply to kind of, you know, to split intentionality down the middle in this way. And I think in some sense you have to reserve intentionality for, in a way, to the discursive level at which Brandom articulates it, you know, and then expose both its, you know, its libidinal and kind of socio-historical conditions. But that's obviously, that's very, very difficult.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if that's you know, an adequate answer, but
but I mean, I'm far closer to your work in answering it, and I know he's not treated as a philosopher, but just to explain very easily, the way I mix your work with Vygotsky is just in terms of the standpoint that I have. So because of my affect, I'm standing a certain way, I'm in a certain position, and because I'm in a certain position, certain things are in reach. So like it affects my activity. It's within my activity would be the like other tradition of doing it, which is in the past set itself up against both phenomenology and psychoanalysis within the activity theory school. We would say this thing which you're calling non-conceptual intentionality is a facet of the dialectical progress of the activity itself. And it's because I have a body in the material world, that there are things that I don't attribute as me that are nonetheless affecting me and being felt by me.
Exactly, but those things I think would have to be so, I mean, even in the case, they would be socially, historically, the reason that they are significant for you, the reason you care about them, the reason, you know, whatever affordances they provide would be kind of socially, historically kind of, you know, mediated. So even your relationship to your kind of, you know, to trees, plants, trees, and rocks, like, you know, would still be kind of mediated by this, you know, social historical kind of domain. So I would resist the idea that affordances, that we can talk about affordances in a purely biological or kind of neurophysiological register.
No, it's exactly not that. It's called cultural historical psychology. So that's the whole point.
Yes, yeah.
We don't have access to a purer whatever. But nonetheless, there's something. None of the one categories captures the thing in ways that exhaust it, and that's why there's still like a role to talk about affect and to say that some of it is being historically accumulated, and some of it is like outside of my view and structuring me because of concrete material conditions, like in a different shape to the conceptual. So it's still structured, and I don't think about it independent of my concepts of it, but nonetheless, it's still changing in a systematic way, and those systems of, let's say there was an earthquake, then obviously that earthquake. Oh well, no. So the best example is Jonathan Lear's one. He criticizes Brandon, saying when all the buffalo were killed, the Crow way of life. It's not like they were like, what is the reason for this? The whole basis of things being the reason for other things collapsed when the buffalo died, because that happens to have actually been a type of given. There was a way in which they had a standpoint towards the world, which they hadn't realized was a given, that wasn't to do. It's absolutely historical. Of course, it's cultural historical, and yet it's the buffalo.
Yes. No, I get. Yeah, I agree. That's very helpful, actually. Thanks.
I would like to pose just one more question, although this might be a little off topic. It seems that some post-Kantian philosophers, especially even post-Hegelian philosophers, especially those who are more inclined to emancipatory politics, have criticized and tried to criticize this concept of possibility as some sort of restriction on emancipatory politics. Even Hegel has this dismissal of the category of possibility in the science of logic. Badiou criticizes the category of possibility. Even Adorno does it sometimes. I wonder what would your take on this be? As the category of possibility, do you think does it limit any sort of conception of emancipation?
Okay, I'm increasingly convinced. I think that one way to understand, for instance, the concerns of post-war French philosophy and of, you know, Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, but also like, you know, Badiou, is this attempt to kind of to develop a concept of possibility severed from substance and essence. In other words, what after the failure of the kind of you know, the revolutionary emancipatory projects of the 20th century, the idea that there's this kind of this deadlock, and we need to kind of to think possibility severed from actuality. So we need a kind of a conception of possibility that would be decoupled from the actual, so that in a way, so that, you know, what is possible would no longer be kind of circumscribed by you know, substantial potentials, or the range of potentialities that are kind of, you know, circumscribed by an essence. And I think that is a kind of a, I think also Adorno, like in a way, is, you know, preoccupied with this issue. And the danger then is that if you kind of, once you decouple possibility from actuality and you say, you know, something can be or something might be, that cannot be, you know, that is not predetermined by what is, you know, then the danger is that it becomes a purely transcendent possibility, which is, you know, kind of relegated to which is no longer kind of, you know, practically effectual. It's not a possibility that you know, that can be realized in and through a practice, okay? And the danger then is of a kind of, you know, the resort to kind of, to either, you know, to theological kind of, it becomes an absolute alterity. Things could be otherwise, we know not how. And, you know, so I think, yeah, the reason that people want to kind of, if you don't believe that things could be otherwise, even if we know not how, it seems you cannot but resign yourself to affirming the actual, which you can't do if you are committed to human emancipation. So I think, yeah, this is a kind of a key problem, and the problem is to kind of to find a, you know, a concept of possibility or a concept of transformation, which is no longer kind of tethered to what is represented as actual, but is also kind of, you know, could be effectuated through practice. Okay, in other words, it's something, it's amenable, it's something that could be realized. Okay, because otherwise, if you have pure possibility or pure potentiality, you know, without any possible kind of register of actualization, then you have divine transcendence. That's God. God can be anything, okay? His potencies are unconstrained by anything that we can recognize as actual, because he is nothing but kind of pure. He's the coincidence of act and potency. Yeah, so I think the problem is to kind of to come up with, you know, to construct a concept of, to think of a concept of possibility that would be, you know, irreducible to representation, but without being relegated to the domain of transcendence, you know, of unknowable transcendence. And in a way, all these discourses about the event, but also about redemption, the standpoint of redemption in Adorno, I think have to do with this. So, yeah, I think it's, and in a way, kind of part of, like, you know, the Deleuzian concept of becoming is also like, becoming is a kind of, precisely is not the actualization of a pre-existing potency. The concept of becoming is an alternative to the concept of potentiality, because potentiality is always anchored in actuality. But in the kind of the Deleuzian case, it goes with this kind of this ontology. You know, becoming is rendered immanent by being ontologized, because everything is becoming, and it's just about degrees of becoming and rates of becoming. So the problem is, how do you do this? How do you liberate possibility from the kind of the prison of actuality without, you know, either kind of resorting to absolute transcendence or without kind of, you know, affirming, saying that everything is really becoming, but we just don't recognize it. And I think that's a problem. I don't know how to resolve it, but I think it's a really key problem.